Humanity has not been overlooked. Humanity has been evaluated. This is a distinction that matters more than it first appears. For decades, the dominant framing of cosmic silence has assumed that the absence of contact reflects an absence of observers. The sky is quiet, the reasoning goes, because no one is there. But there is another reading of the same evidence, one that requires no exotic physics and no leap of faith. The silence may be deliberate. It may be the product of decisions made long before humanity existed, by intelligences operating on timescales we have only just begun to imagine. Consider what a decision actually requires. It requires awareness. It requires criteria. It requires a process by which something is examined and a conclusion reached. If older civilizations exist in our galaxy, and if even a fraction of them have surveyed nearby star systems, then Earth has almost certainly been cataloged. Our atmosphere has been read. Our radio emissions have been logged. Our orbital behavior has been measured. And somewhere in that process, a determination was made about whether engagement was warranted. The conclusion appears to have been no. This script does not argue that aliens are real. It argues something more careful. If they are real, and if they are as advanced as the mathematics of cosmic timing suggests they could be, then their silence is not neutral. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence of a room where someone has looked at us, considered us, and chosen to remain still. The question worth asking is not whether anyone is out there. The question is what we look like to those who are, and why they have decided that the appropriate response is nothing at all. The first thing that must be understood about this kind of evaluation is the scale on which it would occur. When humans imagine being studied by an outside intelligence, they tend to picture something close to themselves, a being with comparable senses, comparable lifespans, and comparable cognitive architecture. This imagination is a failure of perspective. The civilizations most likely to have noticed Earth are not slightly ahead of us. They are not a few centuries more advanced or a few millennia further along in their development. The mathematics of stellar formation in our galaxy permits the existence of technological societies that predate humanity not by hundreds of years, but by hundreds of millions, in some cases by billions. The gap is not generational, it is geological, it is evolutionary. It is, in every meaningful sense, the gap between an observer and an organism that has not yet developed the capacity to recognize that it is being observed. To grasp what this means, it helps to step away from astronomy entirely and consider the analogous situation in our own world. A field biologist studying a colony of leafcutter ants does not announce her presence. She does not introduce herself. She does not attempt to communicate, despite the fact that the ants are engaged in complex coordinated behavior, despite the fact that they possess sophisticated chemical signaling, despite the fact that their society includes agriculture, sanitation, and division of labor. From the ant's perspective, if such a perspective exists, the biologist is not there at all. She is a shadow that occasionally moves, a presence too large and too slow and too alien to register as a fellow agent. The asymmetry between them is so total that the question of contact does not arise. It would not occur to the biologist that contact was even a coherent option, and it would not occur to the ants that they had been observed. This is the relationship that almost certainly obtains between humanity and any civilization sufficiently advanced to have detected us. The asymmetry is not merely technological, it is cognitive. A civilization that has existed for 10 million years, even at a modest rate of intellectual development, would possess conceptual frameworks that no human alive could parse. Their understanding of physics would extend beyond our standard model into regions we have not yet begun to map. Their understanding of biology would treat the emergence and extinction of species the way we treat weather patterns, as predictable consequences of underlying conditions. Their understanding of intelligence itself would be sophisticated enough to recognize with precision what kind of mind they were looking at when they examined the surface of our planet, and what they would see when they looked would not flatter us. They would see a species that has occupied a thin shell of its homeworld for a brief moment of geological time. They would see a species whose total recorded history extends backward only a few thousand years, whose technological civilization is less than 3 centuries old, and whose ability to leave the surface of its planet remains so limited that the moon is the furthest point any human has visited. They would see a species that has not yet stabilized its own population, has not yet learned to manage its own atmosphere, has not yet developed a coherent political structure capable of speaking on behalf of itself, and has not yet demonstrated the capacity to survive its own technological breakthroughs without immediately weaponizing them. From a position of sufficient elevation, humanity does not appear as a peer. It appears as a phase, a transitional state, something that may or may not develop into something more durable, but that is currently too unfinished to engage with. The temptation here is to bristle, to argue that human civilization is more than its failures, that art and mathematics and philosophy and music represent achievements worthy of recognition by any observer. This may be true, but it misses the nature of the asymmetry. The question is not whether humanity has accomplished things worth respecting. The question is whether those accomplishments register as significant from a vantage point that has watched 10,000 species reach similar milestones and either transcend them or destroy themselves. The biologist does not deny that the ants have built impressive structures. She simply does not consider those structures relevant to her own decision-making. They exist on a different scale of importance, in a different conceptual register, in a different category of meaningful activity. There is another dimension to this asymmetry that deserves attention. It is not only that an advanced civilization would know more than we do. It is that the things it would know would change how it perceives us. Consider what a society with full mastery of biology would understand about human cognition. It would know with precision the neurological mechanisms underlying our decision-making. It would understand why we form tribes, why we fear strangers, why we elevate certain ideas into religions and dismiss others as heresy. It would have mapped the cognitive biases that shape our politics, our economics, our relationships. From such a vantage point, the contents of human thought would appear less as the product of free deliberation and more as the predictable output of a particular kind of nervous system operating under particular evolutionary pressures. This is not a hostile reading. It is simply a more complete one. And it is the reading that any sufficiently advanced observer would arrive at, not as judgment, but as accurate description. The same applies to our institutions. An observer with sufficient analytical capacity would see human governments not as the noble structures we describe in civics textbooks, but as evolved systems for managing competition among genetic kin, modified by cultural accretion, currently scaling poorly to global coordination problems. They would see our economic systems not as expressions of value, but as distribution mechanisms shaped by historical accident and rarely optimized for the outcomes their participants claim to want. They would see our wars, our markets, our laws, our religions, all of it, as the expected output of a particular kind of social animal at a particular stage of its development. None of this would make us contemptible. It would make us legible. And legibility, in the eyes of a sufficiently advanced observer, is not the same as importance. This brings us to the central problem with imagining contact across such a gap. Contact requires the existence of something to communicate. Communication, in turn, requires shared reference points, shared concepts, shared frameworks for what counts as meaningful exchange. Between civilizations separated by deep time, those shared reference points may not exist. The questions that would interest an advanced civilization, the kinds of physics they would want to discuss, the kinds of mathematics they would consider trivial, the kinds of philosophical puzzles they had resolved millions of years ago, none of these would map onto what humans are currently capable of understanding. Conversation, in any meaningful sense, would not be possible. And without meaningful conversation, the rationale for contact begins to dissolve. What would they say to us? More importantly, what would we say to them that would be worth their attention? This is not a question with a comfortable answer. The asymmetry runs in only one direction. We have nothing to offer them that they do not already possess in greater quality. We have no information they need, no insight they lack, no perspective they have not already encountered in some earlier civilization further along the same path. The only thing we possess that they do not is our specific particularity, the exact configuration of accidents that produced our specific species in our specific moment. And while that particularity may be interesting in the way that any individual data point is interesting, it does not rise to the level of justifying engagement. A botanist studying a meadow does not stop to introduce herself to every individual blade of grass. What we are confronting, then, is not a failure of cosmic communication. It is the recognition that communication may never have been on the table. The silence is not the absence of a message. It is the presence of a different kind of relationship, one we have been participating in without knowing it, one that has been ongoing for as long as our planet has been visible from the surrounding stars. We are not waiting to be contacted, we are being observed. And the form of attention being paid to us is not the form we hoped for. It is something quieter, more clinical, more detached. It is the attention paid to a system being studied, not the attention paid to a civilization being engaged. And yet, recognizing this does not close the matter. If the relationship is observational, then it implies the existence of observers. And observers, by their nature, are watching for something. The question that follows is what they might be watching for, and why the threshold for further engagement has not yet been crossed. To answer that question, it is necessary to take seriously something that human discourse about extraterrestrial intelligence almost always treats as background, which is the fact that the silence is not random. If aliens were absent from the galaxy, we would expect an empty sky. If aliens were present and broadcasting, we would expect signals. What we observe instead is a third condition. The sky is full of stars whose ages and chemistries permit the emergence of life, full of planets in stable orbits within the temperate zones of their suns, full of the chemical precursors that on our world produced biology, and yet across every wavelength we have examined, across every detection method we have devised, the pattern that returns is consistent. Nothing announces itself, nothing reaches out. The silence is not patchy. It is not noisy in places and clear in others. It is uniform. It covers everything we can see. And uniformity, in scientific terms, is not the signature of randomness. It is the signature of a rule. This is the part of the analysis that tends to unsettle careful thinkers. Random absence and deliberate absence look identical from a distance, but they have different implications. If a single civilization somewhere in our galactic neighborhood had decided independently to remain quiet, we would expect to see signals from elsewhere. Other civilizations making different choices would produce a mixed pattern. Some would broadcast, some would not. The sky would be a mosaic of decisions, some of which we could detect and some of which we could not. That is not what we observe. We observe a pattern so consistent that the simplest explanation, by the standards of scientific reasoning, is that the decision to remain quiet is not idiosyncratic. It is shared. It is, in some sense, coordinated. That coordination need not imply communication among civilizations. It need not imply a treaty or a council or any formal arrangement. It may simply reflect the convergence of similar civilizations onto similar conclusions about how to behave when they encounter younger species. The same way that human cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, independently arrived at similar prohibitions against theft, similar institutions for managing conflict, similar rituals for marking death, advanced civilizations may independently arrive at similar policies regarding contact with developing intelligence. The convergence does not require coordination. It requires only that the underlying logic of the situation is sufficiently clear, that any sufficiently advanced mind reaches roughly the same conclusion. What might that underlying logic be? It begins with the recognition that contact is not a neutral act. From the perspective of an established civilization, reaching out to a developing one introduces consequences that propagate forward. Across timescales, the developing civilization cannot yet perceive. Every piece of information transmitted alters the trajectory of the receiver. Every revelation forecloses certain paths of development and opens others. The choices a young civilization makes about how to organize itself, what to value, what to build, are shaped in ways that cannot be undone by exposure to the choices of older civilizations. Contact is not a gift, it is an intervention, and interventions, even well-intentioned ones, have effects that ripple beyond the intent of the intervener. A sufficiently mature civilization would have learned this lesson the hard way. Somewhere in its own history, there would be records of moments when one part of that civilization made contact with another part, and the consequences were not what either side had anticipated. There would be memories of cultures absorbed, of knowledge misapplied, of technologies introduced before the receiving population was equipped to handle them. The history of our own species provides abundant examples of what happens when one society encounters another while operating from significantly greater technological capacity. The receiving society rarely emerges intact. Its existing patterns of meaning are overwritten. Its existing institutions are rendered obsolete. Its existing ways of life are reduced to artifacts to be studied rather than practices to be lived. Even in cases where the contact was intended to be benevolent, the outcome was rarely benevolent for those who were contacted. An advanced civilization would have absorbed this lesson and generalized it. It would understand that the asymmetry between an established culture and a developing one is not a problem to be solved through good intentions. It is a structural feature of the encounter, present regardless of motive. The only way to avoid the consequences of contact is to avoid contact itself. And so, the policy that emerges across civilizations independently is one of restraint, not because young civilizations are unimportant, but because they are fragile, because their development is contingent on processes that cannot survive premature exposure to the conclusions of older minds. This framework helps explain something that purely technical explanations of the silence cannot. It explains why advanced civilizations would not only refrain from contacting us, but would actively conceal their own presence. If they were simply busy or simply uninterested, we might expect to detect them by accident. We might pick up stray emissions from their industrial activity, the same way an alien observer might pick up our radio leakage. But we do not. And the most parsimonious explanation for that absence of detectable activity is that the activity has been deliberately concealed. The infrastructure of advanced civilization, if it exists, has been engineered to be invisible to younger observers. This is not paranoia on their part. It is courtesy. It is the recognition that visibility itself is a form of contact, that being seen by a younger civilization affects that civilization in ways that cannot be controlled once they begin. There is a deeper layer to this courtesy that deserves attention. It is not only that contact would disrupt a young civilization's development, it is that the very knowledge of contact, the awareness that one is being watched, that one is not alone, that one's choices are being evaluated by minds older and more capable than one's own, fundamentally alters the conditions under which that civilization makes decisions. A species that knows it is being observed does not behave the same way as a species that believes itself to be alone. Its politics shift. Its sense of significance shifts. Its relationship to its own mistakes shifts. Even the awareness of being watched is a form of intervention, one that cannot be undone once it has been introduced. This suggests that the appropriate posture for an advanced civilization studying a younger one is not merely to remain silent, but to remain undetectable, to be sufficiently subtle that even the suspicion of presence does not arise. This is a demanding requirement. It requires that any infrastructure used to observe Earth must be either invisible at the wavelengths we monitor or arranged in ways that resemble natural phenomena, or located at distances and angles that prevent us from resolving them. None of these requirements are physically impossible. They are simply expensive. They require care. They require commitment. They require treating the observation of a young civilization as a serious undertaking rather than a casual one. And this, in turn, tells us something important about the kind of civilizations that might be watching. They are not casual tourists. They are not opportunistic explorers stumbling across Earth and pausing to gawk. They are something more methodical, something more disciplined, something that has institutionalized the practice of observation across timescales long enough to develop protocols, refine techniques, and pass down norms of behavior across generations of observers. The watching itself, if it is occurring, is not an individual act. It is a project, a standing operation, possibly older than our species, possibly older than our genus, possibly older than mammalian life on this planet. The implications of this become more apparent when one considers the alternative. If observation were casual, we would expect inconsistency. We would expect lapses. We would expect some civilizations to behave with discipline and others to behave carelessly, leaving traces. The uniformity of the silence argues against this. It argues for a culture of observation, a shared practice, a sustained discipline that does not vary across the populations of observers we might encounter. This is not the behavior of a galaxy full of independent actors. It is the behavior of a galaxy in which the practice of restraint has become normative, embedded so deeply in the operating assumptions of advanced civilizations that deviation from it is not a live possibility. What does it mean to live inside a system structured this way? It means that the silence we hear when we point our telescopes at the sky is not the silence of an empty universe. It is the silence of a universe organized around a principle we have not yet earned the right to understand. The decisions that produce this silence were made before we existed, by entities we have never seen, on grounds we can only partially reconstruct. We are not participants in those decisions. We are subjects of them. The relationship is settled, and it was settled long before our species learned to ask the question. This may seem like a discouraging conclusion. It need not be. The fact that we are being treated according to a consistent policy implies that there is a policy. The fact that there is a policy implies that there are conditions under which the policy might change. The conditions of our containment are not the conditions of our permanent exclusion. They are the conditions of a particular phase in our development, a phase that has both an entry point and, presumably, an exit. The question is, what marks the boundary between them, and what we would need to do to approach it? The boundary, if it exists, almost certainly has nothing to do with the markers that human cultures have historically associated with civilizational achievement. It does not correspond to population size. It does not correspond to territorial reach. It does not correspond to military capacity, economic output, or the accumulation of scientific publications. These are metrics that matter to us because they reflect our internal competitions, our local hierarchies, our anxieties about status relative to one another. From the perspective of an observer who has watched many civilizations rise and fall, these measurements would appear as surface indicators at best, and at worst, as distractions from the more fundamental questions about whether a species has stabilized into something durable. The metrics that would matter to such an observer are different in kind. They are not metrics of capability. They are metrics of behavior. They concern what a civilization does with the capabilities it acquires, how it manages the consequences of its own development, how it handles the gap between what it can do and what it should do. These are not technical questions. They are questions about coordination, about restraint, about the capacity for a species to act collectively in ways that preserve its own long-term interests against the pressures of its short-term incentives. And by any reasonable measurement, humanity has not yet demonstrated that it possesses this capacity. We have demonstrated, with painful consistency, that we lack it. Consider what an observer would have noted about our nuclear history. Within decades of discovering the principles that govern atomic energy, we constructed weapons capable of erasing the conditions for our own existence. We then deployed those weapons, twice, against civilian populations. We then built more of them. We then built larger ones. We then built enough of them to destroy not only our species, but most of the larger organisms on the planet, and we positioned them around the world in configurations designed to ensure that, in the event of conflict, no one could prevent their use. We have lived with this arrangement for more than 70 years. We have not eliminated it. We have not even significantly reduced it in the past 2 decades. Whatever the political reasons for this failure, the observable fact remains. We possess the means of our own destruction. We have refused to give them up, and we have constructed elaborate justifications for keeping them in readiness. From the outside, this would not appear as a feature of a civilization ready for engagement. It would appear as evidence that the species in question has not yet solved the most basic problem facing any technological culture, which is how to develop tools that exceed your wisdom without using them to destroy yourself. The fact that we have not destroyed ourselves does not resolve the question. It defers it. We are still inside the period during which the resolution remains in doubt. An observer with patience would simply wait. They would not need to predict our outcome in advance. They would only need to wait long enough to see which way the question resolves. The same pattern repeats in other domains. Consider our relationship with our planet's atmosphere. Within 2 centuries of beginning to extract fossil fuels at industrial scale, we have altered the chemical composition of the air in ways that are now measurably affecting climate systems across the globe. We have known about this for more than half a century. We have understood the mechanism for at least 4 decades. We have had the technical capacity to address it for at least 2. And yet the emissions continue to rise. The institutional responses remain inadequate. The collective will to act on the timescales required has not materialized. Whatever the local political reasons for this, the observable fact remains. We are conducting an experiment on the only habitable surface available to us, the outcome of which we cannot predict. And we are doing so despite understanding that the outcome may be catastrophic. These are not isolated failures. They are expressions of a deeper pattern. We are a species whose technological capacity has outpaced our institutional capacity to manage that technology. We invent faster than we govern. We deploy faster than we deliberate. We optimize for short-term gains while accumulating long-term liabilities that we then defer to future generations to resolve. This is not a moral failing in the conventional sense. It is a structural feature of how our cognition interacts with our social organization. We evolved to make decisions that affected small groups across short timescales. We now make decisions that affect billions of people across centuries. The mismatch produces predictable failures, and those failures are visible from any vantage point sophisticated enough to assess them. An observer evaluating us against the criteria of stable civilization would have noticed all of this. They would have logged the dates. They would have measured the trajectories. They would have noted the gap between what we say about ourselves and what we actually do. And on the basis of this evidence, they would have made certain determinations about our readiness. The determinations would not be hostile. They would not even be judgmental in the way humans use that word. They would be diagnostic. They would identify us as a civilization in a particular developmental phase, a phase characterized by specific capabilities and specific deficits, a phase from which some species emerge and others do not. The question of which path we are on is not, from their perspective, mysterious. It is a matter of probability assessment based on observed behaviors. They have seen this pattern before. They know what it tends to produce. The civilizations that survive their adolescence do so by developing certain institutional capacities, by demonstrating certain forms of collective restraint, by establishing certain habits of long-term thinking that operate against the pressures of short-term incentive. The civilizations that do not survive fail at these tasks in characteristic ways. The failure modes are not infinitely varied. They cluster around predictable failures of coordination, predictable failures of foresight, predictable failures to subordinate immediate gratification to long-term necessity. We are exhibiting many of these failure modes. We are not, so far, exhibiting the patterns associated with successful navigation. This is not yet a verdict. It is an assessment in progress. The civilizations watching us, if they are watching, would understand that adolescent civilizations sometimes surprise their observers. They would understand that the trajectory of a developing intelligence is not entirely deterministic, that local choices matter, that moments of inflection can produce unexpected outcomes. They would not have written us off, but they would also not be optimistic. The base rates, if such things can be calculated across the populations of civilizations they have observed, would not favor us. The patterns we are exhibiting are more characteristic of species that fail than of species that succeed. The probability that we will resolve our current dilemmas in time to qualify for engagement is, by any reasonable estimate, not high. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge. It pushes against the optimistic narrative that human cultures construct about their own significance. We prefer to believe that we are exceptional, that our particular configuration of intelligence and creativity and resilience will see us through whatever challenges we face. The historical evidence for this belief is weaker than we like to admit. Most civilizations throughout human history have not survived their challenges. Most have collapsed. Most have left behind only ruins and fragments of cultural memory. The civilizations that did not survive because they were exceptional. They survived because they happened to make a series of fortunate decisions at moments of inflection. The decisions were not always wise. They were sometimes simply lucky. And when the luck ran out, the civilizations ended. We are now facing challenges that operate at a scale beyond anything our species has previously encountered. The decisions we make in the coming decades will determine whether we develop the institutional capacity to manage planetary-scale problems or whether we fail at that task in the way that most civilizations facing comparable challenges have failed. From the outside, this looks like a test. It is not a test we have been entered into deliberately. It is a test that all civilizations face when they reach the level of technological capability that we have reached. The test is not graded by external observers. It is graded by the consequences of our own actions. The observers are simply watching to see how it resolves. What they are watching for, specifically, is whether we develop the kinds of capacities that distinguish surviving civilizations from failing ones. They are watching to see whether we learn to coordinate at planetary scale, whether we learn to subordinate national and tribal interests to species-level concerns, whether we learn to think on timescales that match the timescales of the problems we have created. They are watching to see whether we develop institutions capable of managing technologies more powerful than the ones we currently possess, because we will almost certainly develop those technologies, and the question of whether we can manage them is determined by whether we can manage the ones we have now. They are watching to see whether we learn to value the long-term survival of our species over the short-term advantages of particular groups within it. These are not metrics we can fake. They are not signals we can broadcast to convince an observer that we have crossed the threshold. They are demonstrated through behavior, through institutional outcomes, through the accumulating record of how we actually conduct ourselves over time. An observer with the patience to watch us for centuries would not be fooled by individual moments of apparent progress. They would be looking for sustained patterns, for institutional resilience, for the kinds of changes that persist across political cycles and demographic shifts. And by these criteria, we have not yet provided evidence that we are succeeding. This brings us to a difficult recognition. The silence may not be permanent, it may simply be conditional. The conditions may be ones we can, in principle, meet. But meeting them requires a kind of collective effort that our species has never previously demonstrated on a timescale that does not permit indefinite delay against pressures that are actively working against the changes that would be required. The path to engagement is not closed. It is simply narrow, demanding, and uncertain. And the question of whether we will walk it is being answered every day by the choices we make about who we want to become. If those choices are what the observers are measuring, then it is worth examining how thoroughly such measurements could be conducted from a distance. The intuitive human assumption is that surveillance requires proximity, that to be observed in detail, one must be observed up close. This assumption is wrong even within the limits of our own technology. We are already capable, with current telescopic methods, of detecting the atmospheric composition of planets orbiting distant stars. We can identify the presence of water vapor in those atmospheres, the presence of methane, the presence of carbon dioxide and oxygen, the presence of trace gases whose existence implies particular biological or industrial processes. We can do this across distances of tens, hundreds, even thousands of light years. Our capacity is primitive by any reasonable standard, but it is already sufficient to extract a remarkable amount of information from very small amounts of light. A civilization with capabilities even moderately more advanced than our own would be able to extract substantially more. They would be able to map the surfaces of distant worlds at resolutions sufficient to identify continents, oceans, and major geographical features. They would be able to detect the seasonal cycling of vegetation. They would be able to identify the chemical signatures of industrial activity, the heat signatures of population centers, the electromagnetic emissions of technological societies. None of this requires being physically close to the planet under observation. It requires only sufficient sensitivity, sufficient processing capacity, and sufficient patience to integrate signals over time. Now, extend this capacity by a few orders of magnitude. A civilization that has been operating telescopically for 1,000,000 years, drawing on the resources of an entire stellar system, or perhaps several stellar systems, would possess detection capabilities that we cannot meaningfully describe. They would not need to send probes to study us. They would not need to dispatch ships. They would not need to enter our solar system at all. Everything worth knowing about Earth from a behavioral standpoint can be inferred from the light we emit, the gases we vent, the heat we radiate, and the patterns we trace across our atmosphere and our orbital environment. The technological problem of remote observation, hard as it is from our current position, would have been solved in their distant past. This means that the picture they hold of us is likely more complete than we typically imagine. They would have spectroscopic histories of our atmosphere, extending back through whatever period they have been watching, allowing them to track the rise of industrial pollutants, the depletion of stratospheric ozone, the steady accumulation of carbon in our air. They would have records of our nuclear tests, both atmospheric and underground, the latter detected through the seismic disturbances that accompany them. They would have catalogs of our radio and television broadcasts sorted by frequency and origin, allowing them to map the development of our communications infrastructure with precision. They would have records of the satellites we have placed in orbit, the debris we have generated, the gradual extension of our presence into near-Earth space. From this data, they would have reconstructed our history. Not perfectly, but with sufficient resolution to identify the major patterns. They would know when our agricultural civilizations began to alter the chemistry of our atmosphere through the burning of biomass. They would know when our industrial revolution accelerated that alteration. They would know when our population began to expand into the billions. They would know when we first developed the capacity to leave our planet's surface, and they would know how slowly that capacity has developed since. They would know, in other words, what kind of civilization we are, on what timescale we operate, and what trajectory we are following. The behavioral inferences that follow from this data are not flattering. The pattern an observer would see is one of accelerating consumption, accelerating waste, and accelerating disruption of the planetary systems that support our existence. They would see a species that discovered the principles of its own biology only recently, and immediately began applying those principles to extend individual lifespans, while simultaneously refusing to take collective action that would extend the lifespan of its civilization. They would see a species that achieved the capacity to communicate globally and then used that capacity primarily to amplify its internal divisions. They would see a species that built networks capable of distributing information across the entire planet, and then filled those networks with information designed to confuse, distract, and inflame its own members. None of this is hidden from external view. Our radio leakage carries the content of our communications outward at the speed of light. The patterns of our atmospheric emissions track the patterns of our consumption. The heat signatures of our cities reveal the growth and decline of our economic activity. From far enough away, with the right instruments, the entire texture of human civilization is legible. An observer would not need to land on our planet to understand what we are. They would need only to read what we are constantly broadcasting about ourselves through the simple fact of our existence. This legibility is itself a form of information. It tells an observer not only about our current state, but about our future trajectory. The patterns we exhibit now are not random. They are the predictable outputs of a species at a particular stage of development, behaving in ways that other species at similar stages have also behaved. The observer has likely seen this pattern many times before. They know what tends to come next. They know which paths lead forward and which lead to collapse. And they know, with reasonable confidence, where to place us on the spectrum of probable outcomes. Consider what this means for the question of contact. From their perspective, contact is not a binary choice between engaging and ignoring. It is a continuous decision, evaluated against a constantly updating picture of who we are and what we are becoming. Every year, that picture is refined. Every decade, the trajectory becomes clearer. Every century, the probability assessment grows more precise. They are not making a single decision about whether to engage with humanity. They are making an ongoing series of assessments integrated across long periods of time, weighing the current evidence against the patterns they have observed in other civilizations at comparable stages. This integration over time produces a different kind of judgment than the one humans typically imagine. We tend to think of evaluation as something that happens at a moment, like a court case, with evidence presented and a verdict rendered. An observer operating across deep time would not work this way. They would treat our civilization as a process, not as a point. They would assess us based on the shape of our development across centuries, not on any individual moment within it. A bad decade would not condemn us. A good decade would not redeem us. What matters is the trend, the trajectory, the cumulative pattern of who we are becoming over time. By this standard, the recent record is mixed. There are aspects of our development that an observer would note as positive. We have, in fits and starts, expanded the circle of moral consideration to include groups previously excluded from it. We have developed scientific methods that allow us to correct our own errors, at least when we choose to apply them. We have, in some cases, created international institutions capable of coordinating responses to shared problems, even when those institutions are weaker than the problems they confront. These are not nothing. They represent the early indicators that a species might be capable of the kinds of collective behavior that distinguish surviving civilizations from failing ones. But the negative indicators are also present, and they are more numerous. The expansion of moral consideration has not extended reliably to future generations, whose interests we routinely sacrifice for present convenience. The scientific methods have been selectively applied, often subordinated to ideological commitments that resist correction by evidence. The international institutions have proven inadequate to the scale of the problems they face, paralyzed by the same competitive dynamics that produce the problems in the first place. An observer integrating these signals would not see a clear trend toward maturation. They would see a species struggling with the transition, succeeding in some domains and failing in others, with the outcome still very much in doubt. This is the picture they would hold of us. Not a caricature, not a dismissal. A careful, granular, evidence-based assessment of where we stand and where we appear to be going. From this assessment, the policy of non-contact follows naturally, not as a punishment, not as an exclusion, but as the appropriate response to a civilization that has not yet stabilized into something durable. We are still in the process of becoming. Contact during this process would not help us become anything in particular. It would simply alter the conditions under which we make our own choices, and those alterations would likely be harmful rather than beneficial. The kindest thing they can do is leave us to work out our own development, watching from a distance, waiting to see how it resolves. There is one further consideration that emerges from this analysis, and it deserves explicit attention. The picture they hold of us is not only a picture of our species, it is a picture of our species in context. They would understand things about us that we do not yet understand about ourselves, because they would have the benefit of comparison. They would know how our development compares to the developments of other intelligent species. They would know which of our challenges are universal to civilizations at our stage, and which are specific to the particular accidents of our biology and our history. They would understand us, in some sense, better than we understand ourselves. And that understanding, combined with their distance, would give them the patience to wait. They know what is likely to happen. They are simply watching it happen. This patience, this willingness to watch without intervening, is not a passive state. It is an active discipline, sustained across generations of observers, embedded in the institutional culture of whatever civilizations are conducting the observation. To maintain such a discipline requires a particular kind of ethical framework, one that places enormous weight on the autonomy of developing intelligences and on the dangers of imposing external influence on their development. This framework is not difficult to construct in the abstract. It is difficult to maintain in practice against the temptations that necessarily arise when an advanced civilization observes a younger one struggling with problems that the advanced civilization has long since solved. Imagine the position of such an observer. They have watched our development for centuries, perhaps millennia, perhaps longer. They have seen us make mistakes that they could have prevented with a single transmission. They have seen us suffer consequences that they could have averted with the simplest intervention. They have seen wars, famines, plagues, ecological disasters, all of which they possess the knowledge to prevent or mitigate. The temptation to intervene would be constant. The arguments for restraint would have to be powerful enough to overcome that temptation, not just once, but continuously, across the entire history of contact. The arguments must therefore be load-bearing. They must be sufficient to justify watching billions of beings live and die under conditions that could have been improved. They must hold up against every individual case in which intervention seems obviously called for, because the cases that seem obviously called for are precisely the cases in which restraint is most difficult to maintain. The ethical framework that supports this kind of restraint is not a casual one. It is the product of long reflection, hard-won through the experience of civilizations that have themselves made the mistakes of premature intervention and learned what those mistakes produce. The core of this framework, as best we can reconstruct it from first principles, rests on the recognition that developmental autonomy is not a luxury. It is the precondition for a civilization to become anything worth being. A species that is helped through its difficulties does not learn what its difficulties were trying to teach it. A civilization that is rescued from its mistakes does not develop the institutional capacity to avoid making those mistakes again. The struggles of an emerging intelligence are not obstacles to its development. They are its development. To remove them is to remove the very process by which the intelligence comes into being as something coherent and self-sustaining. This is a hard truth, and it would be especially hard for an observer who has seen the cost of those struggles. The wars we fight are not, from their perspective, regrettable accidents that ought to be prevented. They are part of how we are learning, painfully and slowly, what kind of species we want to be. The mistakes we make with our technology are not failures that an external power should correct. They are the means by which we are working out, through trial and error, the relationship between our capabilities and our responsibilities. To intervene in this process would be to substitute their conclusions for our own, to give us answers we have not earned, to produce a civilization that knows the right things to do without understanding why those things are right. A civilization produced in that way would not be a peer. It would be a client. It would carry within it the unresolved questions that it had been spared the opportunity to resolve. It would lack the institutional muscle memory that comes only from working through hard problems without external help. And in the long run, it would fail in ways that civilizations developed in this manner have always failed, because the foundations were never laid through the species' own efforts. The structure looks like a civilization, but the underlying tissue is borrowed. When pressures come that require independent capacity, the borrowed structure does not hold. This is the lesson that any sufficiently old civilization would have learned, possibly through its own painful experience. There may exist somewhere in the galactic record civilizations that were helped, that received the gifts of more advanced minds, and that subsequently failed in ways their benefactors had not anticipated. There may exist records of well-intentioned interventions that produced consequences worse than the conditions they were meant to alleviate. The mature civilizations now watching us would have absorbed these lessons. They would understand that the desire to help is not the same as the capacity to help. They would understand that the most caring response to a developing civilization is often the most apparently uncaring one. They would understand that watching us suffer is sometimes the price of allowing us to become what we might become. This ethical framework has a name, in a rough sense, in human moral philosophy. It corresponds to certain ideas about non-interference that have emerged in various human cultures, most articulately in the context of anthropological ethics regarding uncontacted peoples. There exist on our own planet, even now, populations of humans who have had minimal contact with the larger global civilization. The scientific consensus on how to treat these populations is clear. They should be left alone. Their isolation should be respected. The temptation to make contact, to study them up close, to offer them the benefits of medical care and technology, must be resisted. The reason is not that they are unimportant. The reason is that contact has historically been catastrophic for such populations. Their immune systems are unprepared. Their social structures cannot absorb the shock of sudden exposure to external influences. Their cultures, evolved across generations to fit specific ecological and social contexts, do not survive translation into the framework of the contacting civilization. The ethical position that has emerged from these experiences is one of strict non-interference, even when interference might appear to be in the contacted population's interest. The reasoning is that we do not actually know what is in their interest. We know what would be in their interest if they were us, but they are not us, and the imposition of our framework on their lives is itself a form of harm, even when conducted with the best intentions. The only way to honor their autonomy is to leave them alone, to watch from a distance if observation is required, to intervene only in extreme circumstances where the alternative is the population's destruction, and even then to intervene as minimally as possible. It is not difficult to imagine that an advanced civilization might apply a similar framework to its relations with developing intelligences elsewhere in the galaxy. The arguments are the same, the temptations are the same, the need for discipline is the same, and the conclusion is the same. The most ethical response to a young civilization is to let it develop on its own terms, observing carefully, refraining from contact except in the most extreme circumstances, and waiting for the civilization to reach a state of development at which contact becomes appropriate. What would such a state look like? It would not be defined by any single technological achievement. It would not be the moment we develop faster than light travel, or fusion power, or artificial general intelligence. These are capabilities, and capabilities can be possessed by civilizations that are not yet ready for contact. The relevant threshold concerns something more fundamental. It concerns whether the civilization has demonstrated the capacity to manage its own development without external help, whether it has stabilized its relationship with its home planet, whether it has worked out internal arrangements that prevent it from destroying itself with its own technology, whether it has developed the institutional maturity to engage with a more advanced civilization without being overwhelmed by the encounter. By these criteria, we are not close. We are still in the phase where contact would do us more harm than good, where engagement would alter our development in ways we are not equipped to manage, where the appropriate posture from an observing civilization is one of continued patient distance. The observers, if they are operating within the ethical framework we have been describing, would understand this. They would not be impatient with us. They would not be frustrated by our slow progress. They would have integrated into their long view the understanding that civilizations develop at their own pace, and that any attempt to accelerate that pace is likely to be counterproductive. There is one final aspect of this ethical framework that deserves consideration. It is the recognition that observation itself is not neutral, even when conducted with care. The act of watching a civilization, even from great distance, even with no intention of intervening, places certain obligations on the observer. The observer becomes, in some sense, a witness to the civilization's development. They become a repository of memory about what the civilization has done and what it has been. And this witnessing, while it does not interfere with the civilization directly, creates a relationship that has its own ethical weight. An observer who has watched humanity for thousands of years possesses knowledge about us that we have largely lost. They would know things about our early history that have not survived in our own records. They would have seen civilizations rise and fall on our planet that we now know only through fragmentary archaeology. They would carry within their archives a picture of our species that is more complete than any picture we can construct for ourselves. This is not a trivial thing. It means that, somewhere in the galaxy, there exists a more accurate version of our own history than the one we possess. The observers know us, in some respects, better than we know ourselves. What they would do with this knowledge, if they chose to share it, It's one of the questions that hangs over the prospect of eventual contact. Would they tell us what they have seen? Would they reveal the parts of our history that we have forgotten? Would they allow us to learn from their records what kind of civilization we have actually been? These are questions for a future moment, if such a moment ever arrives. For now, the relationship remains one-sided. They know us. We do not know them. And the asymmetry of that relationship is sustained, deliberately, by the framework that governs their conduct toward us. That framework, sustained across whatever number of civilizations participate in it, raises a further question that has not yet been fully addressed. If non-contact is the operative policy, what mechanism enforces it? Among any sufficiently large population of intelligent actors, one would expect deviation. One would expect somewhere a civilization that disagrees with the prevailing consensus, that finds the ethical arguments unpersuasive, that decides to make contact for reasons of its own. The uniformity of the silence we observe is difficult to explain if the framework depends solely on voluntary compliance. There must be something else in the system, some force or factor that produces convergence even among civilizations that might otherwise act differently. The simplest explanation, and the one most consistent with what we can reason about advanced civilization, is that the consensus is not merely ethical but practical. Restraint may be the right thing to do, but it is also the prudent thing to do, and the prudential considerations are sufficient on their own to produce convergence even without ethical agreement. To understand why, it helps to think carefully about what an advanced civilization has to lose by making contact with a younger one, and why even civilizations that find the ethical arguments unconvincing would likely arrive at the same operational policy. The first practical concern is contamination. A civilization that has stabilized itself across long timescales has done so by managing carefully the influences that enter its system. Its culture, its institutions, its patterns of thought, all of these represent equilibria that have been arrived at through long processes of refinement. Introducing into such a system the chaotic energy of contact with a younger civilization is not a neutral act. It exposes the older civilization to new ideas, new pathogens, both biological and informational, new questions that may destabilize arrangements that have worked for a very long time. The risk is asymmetric. The younger civilization has little to lose by contact, because it has not yet developed anything worth preserving in its current form. The older civilization has everything to lose. Its stability depends on conditions that contact would disrupt. This asymmetry creates a strong prudential argument for caution that operates independently of any ethical framework. Even a civilization that did not care about the welfare of younger species would have reason to maintain distance from them simply to protect itself. The galaxy, on this analysis, is not silent because of altruism. It is silent because contact is a risk that mature civilizations have learned to avoid. The risk is not primarily that the younger civilization will attack the older one. The asymmetry of capability makes such an attack inconsequential. The risk is more subtle. It is the risk of cultural and informational contamination, of having one's hard-won stability disturbed by exposure to the unresolved questions of a less developed mind. The second practical concern is exposure. A civilization that makes contact with a developing intelligence is not only exposing itself to that intelligence, it is exposing itself to whatever observers might be watching the developing intelligence. The act of contact is visible. It produces signals that other civilizations can detect. It announces to any sufficiently capable observer the location and capabilities of the contacting civilization. In a galaxy where the prevailing consensus is one of non-contact, deviation from that consensus reveals oneself in ways that may be unwelcome. Other civilizations that have invested in maintaining their own concealment have reason to be displeased with a civilization that breaks the silence and, in doing so, draws attention to the existence of advanced life in the region. This produces a second-order incentive structure that reinforces the original consensus. Even a civilization that does not care about the welfare of younger species and does not care about the risk of contamination may still care about the displeasure of other advanced civilizations. The cost of breaking the consensus is not only direct, it is also social, in whatever sense that word applies to relations among civilizations. To act unilaterally is to invite responses from peers who have a stake in the maintenance of the existing order. And the responses available to advanced civilizations against one of their own that has acted irresponsibly are not necessarily ones that the deviant would welcome. The third practical concern is the question of what contact would actually accomplish. From the perspective of an advanced civilization, what is the goal? What is the desired outcome? If the answer is to share knowledge, then the question becomes whether the receiving civilization is equipped to absorb the knowledge in question. If it is not, then the sharing is futile. If the answer is to acquire information, then the question becomes whether the contacting civilization could not acquire the same information through observation without the risks of contact. In almost every case, it could. The information available through contact is rarely information that requires contact. It is information that requires only patience and observation, both of which an advanced civilization possesses in abundance. If the answer is to establish a relationship, then the question becomes, what kind of relationship is possible across such asymmetric capabilities? The honest answer is that no meaningful relationship is possible. There can be no peer-to-peer exchange when one party is millions of years more developed than the other. There can be no genuine collaboration when one party already knows everything the other could contribute. There can be no friendship in any sense that either party would recognize when the cognitive gap is unbridgeable. What remains is a relationship of caretaker and charge, of teacher and student, of patron and dependent. And these relationships, while they may be sustainable in some contexts, are not relationships that produce mutual benefit. They produce, at best, the temporary satisfaction of the more capable party at having helped, and the permanent dependence of the less capable party on having been helped. For all these reasons, the prudential case for non-contact converges with the ethical case. Even civilizations that disagree about the ethics arrive at the same operational policy. And this convergence, sustained across the population of advanced civilizations in our galaxy, produces the uniformity of silence that we observe. The silence is overdetermined. It is the joint product of ethical conviction and practical wisdom, reinforcing one another, producing a consensus so robust that deviation has become exceedingly rare. There is another factor that may contribute to this robustness, one that is more speculative but worth considering. It is the possibility that the consensus is enforced not only through social pressure, but through structural arrangements that prevent deviation from being effective. Imagine that the advanced civilizations of our galaxy have developed over time monitoring systems that detect attempts by any civilization to make contact with developing intelligences. Imagine that these monitoring systems are coupled with interventions that neutralize such attempts before they can succeed. The interventions need not be hostile. They could simply involve intercepting signals, disabling probes, or otherwise preventing contact from being completed. The effect would be to make deviation from the consensus operationally impossible, regardless of any individual civilization's wishes. This would produce a galaxy in which contact is not merely discouraged, but actively prevented. The silence we observe would be the product not only of voluntary restraint, but of enforced quarantine. The developing civilizations of the galaxy would be protected from contact, whether the established civilizations approved of the protection or not. The system would be self-stabilizing, resistant to defection, and capable of maintaining itself across very long periods of time. Whether such a system exists, we cannot know, but its existence would explain features of the silence that other explanations struggle with. It would explain the uniformity. It would explain the absence of detectable infrastructure. It would explain why even casual observation of our region produces no evidence of activity. And it would explain why we have never detected anomalies, never picked up signals that might have been intended for us, never received any of the kinds of contacts that one would expect from a galaxy populated by civilizations operating under varying policies. The system has been designed, or has evolved, to produce a particular outcome, and that outcome is being maintained with considerable success. If this is the situation we are in, then the implications are worth considering carefully. We are not simply being ignored, we are being protected, whether we want to be or not, by an arrangement that operates independently of our preferences. The arrangement is benign in intent, or at least appears to be benign by the standards of the civilizations that maintain it. It is also non-negotiable. We cannot opt out of it. We cannot, by any action we might take, force contact to occur. The decision is not ours to make. It belongs to the systems and civilizations that have organized the silence we live within. There is something humbling in this. Humans are accustomed to thinking of themselves as agents whose choices matter, whose actions shape outcomes, whose preferences carry weight in the world. The recognition that, on the question of contact with other civilizations, our preferences carry no weight at all, is difficult to absorb. We can broadcast our presence as loudly as we wish. We can send probes into the interstellar medium. We can announce our existence to any audience we can imagine. None of it produces a response. The audience is there. The audience is listening. The audience has made its decision, and our actions, however vigorous, do not alter that decision in any way we can detect. This is not the relationship we hope to have with the cosmos. We hope to be discoverers, finding companions in the dark. We have instead become discovered, observed by companions who have chosen not to introduce themselves. The asymmetry of this situation is uncomfortable. It places us in a position we are not accustomed to occupying, the position of being the studied rather than the studier, the position of being known by entities we cannot know in return. And yet this is, as best we can reason about it, the situation in which we find ourselves. The question is what to do about it, and whether anything can be done at all. The question of what to do is more difficult than it first appears, because the available actions are constrained by the very asymmetry that defines our situation. We cannot reach out to entities we cannot locate. We cannot negotiate with parties who have already determined the terms of the relationship. We cannot, by any conventional means, alter a verdict that was rendered before we knew it was being considered. What remains available to us is something narrower, but possibly more important. We can examine ourselves. We can consider what we are becoming, and whether the trajectory of our development gives any reason to suppose that the present silence might one day end. This examination begins with a recognition that the criteria for reevaluation, whatever they are, almost certainly involve internal changes within our civilization rather than external demonstrations of capability. We cannot, by building bigger telescopes or sending more probes, prove ourselves worthy of contact. The capabilities that might impress us are not the capabilities that would impress an observer who has watched 10,000 civilizations achieve them. What might impress such an observer is something we have not yet shown ourselves capable of, which is the development of institutional arrangements that successfully manage planetary-scale problems on the timescales those problems require. This is a particular kind of test, and it is not one we have been preparing for. Our civilization has organized itself around competition, both within and between societies. We have built our economic systems around the accumulation of advantage by individuals and groups. We have built our political systems around the management of conflicts among parties with divergent interests. We have built our technological systems around the production of value that can be measured, marketed, and exchanged. None of these arrangements were designed for the management of planetary-scale problems. They were designed for the management of smaller problems, problems that fit within the boundaries of states or markets or industries. When we attempt to apply them to planetary-scale problems, they perform poorly, because the problems they were built to solve are not the problems we are now facing. The mismatch is visible in our failures to address climate change, our failures to coordinate responses to global pandemics, our failures to manage the risks associated with rapidly advancing technologies. Our failures to prevent the depletion of resources whose long-term availability is essential to our continued existence. None of these failures result from a lack of knowledge. We know what needs to be done in broad outline in each of these domains. The failures result from a lack of institutional capacity to act on what we know. Our institutions were not built to coordinate action across planetary scales and multi-generational timescales. They are being asked to perform a task they were not designed for, and they are performing it badly. The remedy, if there is one, requires the development of new kinds of institutions, ones explicitly designed for the scales and timescales of the problems we now face. This is a difficult project. It requires the construction of arrangements that can coordinate action across nations, across cultures, across generations. It requires the development of decision-making procedures that can weigh long-term consequences against short-term incentives. It requires the cultivation of forms of collective identity that extend beyond the boundaries of nation and tribe to encompass the species as a whole. None of these requirements are easy to meet. All of them require changes in human thought and behavior that historically have taken many generations to accomplish, if they have been accomplished at all. And yet, the timescales available to us for this project are not unlimited. The problems we face are not waiting for us to develop the institutional capacity to address them. They are advancing on their own schedule, driven by the dynamics of physical and biological systems that operate independently of our political processes. The window during which we can still address these problems while remaining open is not infinitely wide. It is narrowing, and if it closes before we have developed the institutions we need, the consequences are likely to be severe enough that the question of contact with other civilizations will become academic. A civilization that has collapsed before reaching maturity is not a candidate for reevaluation. It is simply a record in someone else's archive, an entry in the catalog of species that did not make it. The observers, if they are watching us at exactly this moment. They are watching to see whether we will make the transitions that would qualify us for further consideration. They are watching to see whether we will develop the kinds of institutions that distinguish civilizations that survive from those that do not. They are watching to see whether the species that broadcast its presence into the dark, beginning a little more than a century ago, will mature into something worth meeting, or whether it will join the long list of intelligent species that achieve technological capability without the wisdom to manage that capability for long. What would the development of such wisdom actually look like in observable terms? It would look like a species that had begun to take seriously the consequences of its own actions, not in the rhetorical sense in which we already do this, but in the operational sense of actually adjusting behavior in response to anticipated consequences. It would look like a species that had developed the capacity to make decisions on behalf of generations not yet born, treating their interests as comparable in weight to the interests of those currently alive. It would look like a species that had learned to subordinate the competitive dynamics of its internal politics to the cooperative requirements of its planetary stewardship. It would look, in short, like a species that had stopped behaving as a collection of competing groups occupying a shared planet, and had begun behaving as a single civilization with shared responsibilities and shared interests. This is not the species we currently are. It may be the species we are becoming, but the evidence for this is mixed, and the rate of change is not encouraging. The cultural and institutional patterns that would need to change are deeply embedded in our societies. They are reinforced by the structures of our economies, the architectures of our governments, the assumptions of our educational systems. Changing them requires effort against the inertia of arrangements that have served us well in the past, even as they fail us in the present. The effort is being made in various places and in various forms, but it is not yet sufficient to the scale of the problem. Whether it will become sufficient in time is the question on which everything else depends. If it does become sufficient, if we do make the transition that the situation requires, then the consequences extend beyond the immediate benefits of solving our planetary problems. We would, in the process of solving those problems, develop the institutional capacities that would make us a different kind of civilization. We would become a species that had demonstrated, through its actions, that it could manage planetary-scale problems on the timescales they require. We would become a species that had stabilized its relationship with its home world, that had developed durable institutions for collective decision-making, that had cultivated the kinds of long-term thinking that distinguish surviving civilizations from failing ones. These are exactly the kinds of capabilities that an external observer might be watching for. Not as criteria we were trying to meet to impress them, but as the natural consequence of becoming the kind of civilization that can survive its own technological adolescence. The qualifications for contact on this view are not external standards imposed by other civilizations. They are the internal qualities that any civilization would need to develop in order to survive into a phase where contact becomes meaningful. The test is not graded by the observers, it is graded by the consequences of our own actions. The observers are simply watching to see how the grading turns out. This framing has a certain elegance to it. It suggests that the path to potential contact runs through the same processes that would secure our long-term survival, regardless of whether contact ever occurs. The reasons to develop better institutions are the same, whether we are seeking eventual engagement with other civilizations or simply seeking to remain in existence as a species. The reasons to develop long-term thinking are the same. The reasons to develop planetary-scale coordination are the same. The work that would qualify us for contact is the work we need to do anyway, for our own sake, regardless of who else might or might not be watching. This is in some ways a comforting thought. It means that we are not being asked to perform for an audience. We are being asked to become what we need to become for our own survival, and the consequences of that becoming, if successful, would happen to align with the conditions under which contact might eventually be considered. The two projects are the same project, viewed from different angles. Working on either is working on both. There is no need to choose between developing our civilization for its own sake and developing our civilization to qualify for contact. They are the same enterprise. This thought also clarifies what it would mean for the observers to be watching with patience rather than impatience. They are not waiting for us to make a particular choice that they have already specified. They are waiting for us to develop the capacities that any civilization needs to develop in order to participate meaningfully in the broader community of intelligent life. They have seen this development happen in some civilizations and fail to happen in others. They know what it looks like. They know what conditions favor it and what conditions impede it. They are watching us, not with judgment, but with the same kind of attention a gardener gives to a sapling whose mature form is not yet determined. The sapling will grow into something, but what it grows into depends on factors that even the most patient gardener cannot fully control. There is, however, a darker reading of this same situation that should not be dismissed. The framing of patient observation of mature civilizations waiting for us to become worthy of contact assumes a benevolent posture on the part of the observers. It assumes that they want us to succeed, that they are rooting for our development, that they would welcome our eventual joining of whatever broader community they participate in. These assumptions are flattering to us. They place us at the center of someone else's concern. They make us the object of a kind of cosmic care, even if that care expresses itself through distance. We should examine whether these assumptions are warranted or whether they are products of our own hopes rather than honest readings of the available evidence. The honest reading begins with a recognition that we have no evidence for benevolent intent. We have no evidence for malevolent intent either. We have only the fact of silence, and silence is consistent with many different attitudes on the part of those who maintain it. Benevolent observers would be silent. Malevolent observers might also be silent if they had reasons of their own to remain unannounced. Indifferent observers would be silent because they had no reason to break the silence. The data does not distinguish among these possibilities. Our preference for the benevolent reading reflects our hope rather than our analysis. Consider the indifferent reading more carefully. It is possible that the civilizations observing us, if they exist at all, have no particular interest in our development. We are not their project. We are not their concern. They are not waiting for us to mature. They are simply aware of us, in the way that a person walking down a city street is aware of the pigeons in the square without any particular investment in what the pigeons do or become. The pigeons are part of the landscape. They are noted perhaps, but they do not occupy the walker's attention. The walker has other concerns. The walker is going somewhere. The pigeons are not part of the journey. If this is the situation, then the silence is not the product of patient watching. It is the product of disinterest. The observers, if they are observers at all, have moved on to other matters. They have their own projects, their own concerns, their own developmental challenges that occupy whatever attention they have to spare. Earth is a planet they noticed, perhaps long ago, perhaps recently, and they have not noticed it again since. They are not waiting for us to become anything. They are simply not thinking about us at all. This reading is less flattering, but it may be more accurate. Consider what an advanced civilization actually has to do with its time. It has, by hypothesis, achieved a level of capability that places it far beyond the survival concerns that occupy younger species. It has solved, presumably, the basic problems of energy and matter that constrain less developed civilizations. What remains for such a civilization is whatever questions it finds interesting, whatever projects it finds compelling, whatever directions it chooses to pursue with the freedom that its capabilities provide. Among the infinity of possible directions such a civilization might pursue, the careful study of every developing intelligence in its galactic neighborhood is unlikely to be the highest priority. There are simply too many such intelligences. The galaxy contains, by reasonable estimates, billions of star systems capable of supporting life. Even if only a small fraction of these have produced intelligent species, that fraction still represents a number too large to track in detail. An advanced civilization might be aware of the existence of developing intelligences in a broad sense, the way a biologist is aware of the existence of beetles without being interested in the particular trajectory of any individual species. The cataloging exists, the detailed attention does not. We are part of a database, not a research project. This framing has consequences for how we should think about the silence. It means that the silence is not a verdict on us specifically. It is the default condition for any civilization at our stage, regardless of its specific qualities. We are not being ignored because we have failed some test. We are being ignored because we have not yet done anything sufficiently interesting to merit specific attention. The criteria for merit in this reading are not the criteria of survival or maturity. They are the criteria of novelty, of doing something that older civilizations have not seen before. And by these criteria, we are doing nothing remarkable. We are following a developmental trajectory that has been followed many times by many species in many star systems with outcomes that are statistically predictable. If we want to be noticed, in this reading, we would need to do something genuinely new. We would need to deviate from the patterns that have been observed many times before. We would need to develop in some unexpected direction to make some choice that older civilizations had not seen made in the same way before, to produce some configuration of capability and behavior that surprised the observers. Whether this is possible, given the constraints of our biology and our history, is unclear. We may be too predictable, too constrained by our inheritance to produce the kind of novelty that would attract specific attention. Or we may be capable of surprises that we have not yet manifested, that lie ahead of us in directions we have not yet explored. There is yet another reading that is darker still. It is the possibility that the silence reflects not indifference, but considered avoidance. The observers, if they exist, may have evaluated us and concluded that we are not worth engaging with, not because we are immature, but because of what we are likely to become. There may exist patterns of development that mature civilizations have learned to recognize, patterns that lead to outcomes that the older civilizations find objectionable. A species that exhibits these patterns may be flagged for permanent exclusion rather than temporary observation. The silence, in this case, is not the prelude to eventual contact. It is the established and permanent relationship that the observers have determined is appropriate. What might trigger such a categorization? It would not be the temporary failings of a civilization in its adolescent phase. Those failings are universal. They are expected. They do not by themselves mark a civilization as permanently unwelcome. What might mark a civilization in that way is something more structural, some feature of its biology or its psychology that predicts long-term incompatibility with the broader community of advanced civilizations, some tendency that, even if temporarily suppressed, is likely to reassert itself once the civilization achieves sufficient capability. Some characteristic that makes the civilization, in some deep sense, the wrong kind of mind to engage with. Whether humanity exhibits such a characteristic, we cannot know from the inside. The judgment, if it has been made, would be based on observations and analyses that we are not in a position to reproduce. We can speculate about what such observations might have noticed. We can wonder whether our species' history of violence, our pattern of expansion at the expense of other species, our tendency to organize ourselves around hierarchies of dominance, our difficulty in cooperating across the boundaries of in-group and out-group might mark us as a kind of intelligence that older civilizations have learned to keep at distance. These are uncomfortable hypotheses. They cannot be confirmed or refuted from the available evidence. They are, however, consistent with what we observe, and they should not be dismissed simply because they are unflattering. The truth is that we do not know which of these readings is correct. We do not know whether the silence reflects patient observation, indifferent cataloging, or considered avoidance. Each reading is consistent with the data. Each carries different implications for how we should think about our situation and what, if anything, we should do about it. The honest position is one of uncertainty, acknowledging that the silence permits multiple interpretations and that we lack the evidence to choose among them with confidence. What we can say, however, is that all of these readings share a common feature. They all describe a relationship in which we are not active participants. The decisions that produce the silence, whatever their motivations, are made by others on the basis of considerations we do not control, and they are not subject to revision based on our preferences. We are the objects of these decisions, not the subjects. We can be observed, ignored, or avoided, but we cannot be consulted. The relationship is asymmetric in every dimension that matters, and the asymmetry is sustained by structural features of the situation that we cannot alter. This is, in some respects, the most important fact about our situation. It is not that we are alone in the universe. We may well not be. It is that we are alone in the sense that matters most, which is that the decisions that shape our cosmic situation are made without reference to us. Whether other civilizations exist, what they think of us, whether they will ever engage with us, all of this is determined by factors that lie entirely outside our influence. We can broadcast our presence, we can develop our civilization, we can become whatever we are capable of becoming, but the response to all of this remains in the hands of others. We are, in this fundamental sense, alone with our own development, and the question of who else might be watching is one we cannot answer by any action we might take. Living with this kind of aloneness is a psychological challenge that humans have not yet learned to manage well. Throughout our history, we have organized our self-understanding around the idea that we are at the center of something. Religious traditions placed us at the center of creation, the special object of divine attention. Pre-modern cosmologies placed our planet at the center of the universe, the fixed point around which all else revolved. Even after the scientific revolution displaced us from these literal centers, we retained a kind of metaphorical centrality. We were the species that had developed language, that had built civilizations, that had reached toward the stars. Our specialness was no longer cosmic, but it was still ours. We were unique in some important way, even if the uniqueness was harder to specify than it had been. The possibility that we are not unique, that we are one of many intelligent species in the galaxy, and that the others have decided to leave us alone, requires a different kind of self-understanding. It requires us to absorb the fact that our existence may not be of particular significance to anyone except ourselves. The other civilizations, if they exist, are not waiting for us. They are not invested in our success. They are not, in any meaningful sense, our peers. They are, at best, distant observers who have chosen not to engage. At worst, they are not even observers, but merely entities whose existence runs parallel to our own without intersecting it at any meaningful point. This is a difficult thing to absorb. It runs against a deep human desire to matter, to be part of something larger than ourselves, to participate in some grand cosmic story in which our actions have significance. The recognition that the cosmic story, if there is one, does not need our participation, that we could disappear from it without altering its trajectory in any way that anyone but us would notice, is a kind of demotion that our cultural traditions are not well equipped to handle. We have stories about humility, about the smallness of human life against the scale of nature, but most of these stories still preserve some sense that our smallness is being witnessed, that someone or something is paying attention to us, even as our smallness is acknowledged. The possibility that no one is paying attention, that our smallness is not even noticed, is one we have not yet found language for. And yet, the psychological challenge of absorbing this possibility may be less severe than it first appears. The fact that we are not at the center of cosmic attention does not mean that our existence is meaningless. It means only that the meaning of our existence is something we will have to construct for ourselves, without reference to external validation. This is not a new task. It is the task that every individual human life faces in some form. The recognition that the universe does not care about us, that we will not be remembered by the cosmos, that our individual lives matter only to ourselves and to those who love us, is something that humans have been absorbing in personal terms for as long as we have been capable of thinking about it. What is being asked of us now is to absorb the same recognition at the species level. The universe does not care about humanity any more than it cares about any individual human. The meaning of being human, like the meaning of being any particular human, is something we will have to make for ourselves. This task, demanding as it is, has its own possibilities. A species that has come to terms with its own cosmic insignificance is freed from certain illusions that have shaped its history. It is freed from the belief that it is destined for greatness, that its place in the cosmos is assured, that its survival is part of some larger plan. The recognition that nothing is assured, that survival depends on choices we ourselves must make, that the future is genuinely contingent on our own actions, can be a source of energy and purpose rather than despair. The cosmos is not going to save us. No one is going to come to our aid. The work of becoming a viable civilization is ours to do, and the doing of it is its own justification, regardless of whether anyone else is watching. There is something dignified in this position. It is the dignity of a creature that has accepted its own situation and has decided to act on it without consolation. We are not the chosen species. We are not the destined inheritors of some cosmic future. We are simply a species that has emerged on a particular planet, in a particular star system, at a particular moment in cosmic history, and we are responsible for what we make of our circumstances. The responsibility is ours, the outcomes will be ours, the story will be whatever story we manage to tell with the time and capabilities we possess. This framing also has implications for how we think about the possibility of eventual contact. If contact ever does occur, it will not be a vindication. It will not confirm that we were always special, that the others were waiting for us all along. It will be more likely a recognition that we have developed to a point where the prior reasons for distance no longer apply. The recognition will not change who we have been. It will only acknowledge what we have become, and what we have become will have been determined by our own choices, made in the absence of external guidance, sustained across the long timescales required for civilizational maturation. This is the only kind of meeting worth having. A meeting predicated on our having earned it in the only sense in which earning can be done, which is by becoming a kind of civilization that other civilizations recognize as something worth engaging with. The recognition cannot be granted in advance. It cannot be claimed as a right. It can only be conferred after the fact in response to what we have actually demonstrated about who we are. And the demonstration, whatever form it takes, will be ours to give. The observers, if they exist, are not going to coach us through it. They are simply going to watch and, eventually, respond to whatever we manage to produce. There is one further consideration worth raising before we move toward the conclusion of this analysis. It is the question of what we ourselves should do, given the situation we are in. If contact is unlikely in the near term, if the observers are watching from a distance, if our actions will be evaluated only in retrospect and only on the basis of what we actually accomplish, then what is the appropriate posture for us to adopt? Should we continue to search for evidence of other civilizations, knowing that the search is unlikely to succeed in any time frame relevant to current human lives? Should we continue to broadcast our presence, knowing that the broadcasts will not produce responses? Should we organize our scientific and cultural activities around the possibility of eventual contact, or should we accept that such contact is sufficiently improbable that it does not warrant significant investment? The answer, I think, is that we should continue with all of these activities, but for reasons that have less to do with the possibility of contact and more to do with what the activities themselves do to us. The search for other civilizations, even if it does not find them, sharpens our scientific capabilities and expands our understanding of the universe. The broadcasting of our presence, even if it does not produce responses, exercises our capacity to think about ourselves from the outside, to consider how we might appear to others. The organization of our cultural activities around the possibility of contact, even if contact never comes, helps us imagine ourselves as part of something larger than our immediate concerns. These are valuable things in themselves, regardless of whether they produce the outcomes we hope for. There is also something to be said for the persistence of hope. We do not know that contact will never occur. We do not know that the silence is permanent. We do not know that the observers have written us off. The possibility, however slim, that things might change at some future moment is worth maintaining. Not because we have evidence that they will, but because the maintenance of the possibility shapes who we are in the present. A civilization that has given up on the prospect of eventual cosmic engagement is a different civilization from one that is not. Which kind we want to be is a choice that lies within our power, regardless of what the observers do or do not decide, and the choice to remain hopeful, to remain engaged with the larger questions, to remain interested in the possibility of contact, even as we acknowledge its current improbability, is a choice that seems worth making for its own sake. This is not the same as confidence. We should not pretend that we have reasons to expect contact that we do not have. We should not construct narratives in which we are central to a cosmic story that may not require us. But we can maintain an openness to possibilities we cannot foresee, a willingness to be surprised, a recognition that our current understanding of the situation may be incomplete in ways we cannot yet specify. The universe has surprised us many times in our scientific history. It may surprise us again. The honest acknowledgement of uncertainty is not the same as the abandonment of hope. It is, in some respects, the only kind of hope that is intellectually defensible. What remains, then, is to consider where this analysis leaves us. We have traced through a long argument about the possible reasons for cosmic silence, the possible attitudes of those who maintain it, the possible criteria by which a developing civilization might be evaluated, and the possible postures we might adopt in response. The argument has not produced a definitive conclusion because the available evidence does not permit one. What it has produced is a more careful understanding of the questions involved and a clearer sense of what we can and cannot say about our situation. What we can say is this: the silence of the cosmos is real. It has been confirmed by decades of careful observation across multiple wavelengths and detection methods. It is not the silence of a universe we have not yet looked at. It is the silence of a universe we have looked at carefully, and from which we have heard nothing in return. This silence is the central fact about our cosmic situation, and any account of that situation must begin from it. What we can also say is that the silence is consistent with multiple explanations. It might mean that we are alone, that no other intelligent species exists within range of our detection. It might mean that other species exist but have not yet reached the technological capability to broadcast detectably. It might mean that other species have reached such capability, but have chosen, for reasons of their own, to remain silent. And among these possibilities, the deliberate silence reading carries certain implications that the others do not. It implies that we are being observed. It implies that observation produces decisions. It implies that those decisions, whatever they are, have so far come down on the side of distance. Whether this reading is correct, we cannot determine from the evidence available to us. What we can do is examine its implications, take them seriously as a possibility, and consider what they would mean for how we conduct ourselves. If we are being observed, then the observers know more about us than we know about them. They have seen our history, measured our trajectory, formed assessments of our likely future. The assessments they have formed are probably not the assessments we would form of ourselves, because our self-understanding is shaped by our position inside the situation, while theirs is shaped by their distance from it. They see us, in some sense, as we are, rather than as we wish to be. And what they see, by any reasonable analysis, is a species in the middle of a developmental phase whose outcome is not yet determined. The outcome, whatever it turns out to be, will be determined by us. The choices we make about how to organize our civilization, how to manage our planet, how to handle the technologies we have developed and the technologies we will develop, will determine whether we mature into something durable or whether we join the long list of intelligent species that did not survive their adolescence. The observers, if they are watching, are not going to make this determination for us. They are simply going to record it when it occurs and revise their assessments accordingly. This places us in a particular kind of situation. We are responsible for our own development without external help, without external guidance, without any guarantee that our efforts will succeed. We are also responsible for our own development without external interference, without any meddling from those who might have preferences about what we become. The silence on this reading is not a denial of our significance. It is the condition under which we are permitted to become significant, on our own terms, through our own efforts. The autonomy is total, and so is the responsibility. We are alone with our own future, and what we make of it is entirely up to us. There's a certain kind of freedom in this. It is the freedom of a creature that has been given the opportunity to develop without being told what to develop into. The opportunity is rare, in some sense. Most civilizations, on the analysis we have been considering, do not survive to the point where this opportunity becomes apparent to them. They fail before they recognize what they were being given. The recognition itself is part of what comes with development, the slow realization that the silence is not an absence of attention, but the condition of one's own becoming. Whether we will use this opportunity well, whether we will become the kind of civilization that survives long enough to be eventually engaged with, remains to be seen. It is worth considering, finally, what the long-term picture might look like if we do survive. Imagine a future in which humanity has made the transitions required by its current challenges. Imagine that we have stabilized our relationship with our planet, developed institutions capable of planetary-scale coordination, mastered the technologies that currently threaten us, and emerged into a sustainable equilibrium that could be maintained across geological timescales. Imagine that we have expanded our presence into the solar system, established self-sustaining populations on other worlds, and developed the kinds of resilience that come from being a multi-planet species. Imagine that we have continued our scientific development, deepening our understanding of physics and biology and intelligence, and that this understanding has begun to approach the level at which our questions and the questions of advanced civilizations might overlap. In such a future, the conditions that currently produce the silence would begin to change. We would no longer be a fragile young civilization whose development could be disrupted by contact. We would be a stabilized presence in the cosmos, capable of engaging with other civilizations on something closer to equal footing, possessing the institutional maturity to absorb whatever shocks contact might produce. The reasons for the current distance would begin to dissolve. The probability of contact would begin to rise, not because we had demanded it, but because we had become the kind of civilization for which contact is appropriate. This future is not guaranteed. It may not occur. We may fail before reaching it. But it is a future that lies within the realm of possibility, and the work that would produce it is the work that we should be doing anyway, for our own reasons, regardless of whether contact ever happens. The path to becoming a civilization worth engaging with is the same path as the path to becoming a civilization that survives. The two destinations are the same destination, and the road that leads to either leads to both. The eventual meeting, if it occurs, will not be what we have imagined in our science fiction. It will not involve ships descending from the sky to greet us with messages of welcome. It will not involve signals appearing in our radio telescopes with diagrams of how to reach our neighbors. It will involve, more likely, a quieter form of recognition. A signal, perhaps, that we did not expect, indicating that something had changed in the relationship. An anomaly that resolves itself into something other than coincidence. A pattern that, once recognized, makes clear that the silence has ended. The form of the recognition will be theirs to choose, because they hold the initiative in this relationship and always have. Our role will be to receive whatever they offer with whatever readiness we have managed to develop by that point. Until then, the silence continues. It is the condition under which we live, the background against which our civilization is developing, the constant fact that shapes our cosmic situation regardless of whether we attend to it or ignore it. We can attend to it or not as we choose. We can imagine the observers or dismiss them as we choose. We can prepare for eventual contact or treat the prospect as fantasy as we choose. None of our choices will alter the underlying situation. The silence is not waiting for our response. It is simply present, ongoing, the texture of the universe we inhabit. What we do with our presence in this universe is the only question that ultimately matters. Whether anyone is watching, whether anyone will ever respond, whether we are alone or in company we cannot yet recognize, the work in front of us is the same. We are responsible for ourselves. We are responsible for our planet. We are responsible for whatever future we manage to construct out of the materials available to us. The silence around us does not change any of this. It only frames it, providing the cosmic context within which our specific local responsibilities take their place. Perhaps in the end, this is what the silence is teaching us. Not that we are unimportant, but that our importance is something we must construct rather than receive. Not that we are alone, but that the meaning of our existence cannot depend on the presence or absence of others. Not that we have been ignored, but that the attention we most need is our own attention, focused on the difficult work of becoming something durable enough to deserve our own self-respect. The cosmos has not delivered to us a community of peers. It has delivered to us a long silence within which we must find our own voice, build our own institutions, develop our own wisdom. The work is ours. The outcome is ours. And whether anyone else is watching in the end is less important than whether we are watching ourselves with sufficient honesty to see what we are doing and the courage to do it well. The verdict, if there is one, has been rendered. We have not been chosen. We have not been welcomed. We have not been invited to join any community larger than the one we make for ourselves. What we have been given, instead, is the silent space in which to become whatever we are capable of becoming. The space is generous. It is the size of a galaxy. It is older than our species and will outlast our species, whatever we make of it. And within this space, the question of who we are, what we are doing here, and what we are going to become is a question only we can answer. The observers, if they exist, are waiting to see what we will say. The answer, when it comes, will be ours alone. The verdict on whether we are worth meeting is being written every day by the choices we make about who we want to be. And the writing of that verdict, like the meeting itself if it ever occurs, is entirely in our own hands. The hands that hold this responsibility are not, however, the hands of a unified species making coherent choices. They are billions of pairs of hands, each attached to individuals with their own concerns, their own communities, their own immediate pressures that often have nothing to do with the long-term trajectory of human civilization. The question of who we become, while in some abstract sense ours to answer, is in practical terms answered by the aggregate of countless small decisions made by people who are not thinking about the cosmic implications of their choices. The farmer deciding what to plant, the engineer deciding what to build, the politician deciding what to vote for, the parent deciding what to teach. All of these decisions accumulate into something that, when viewed from a distance, looks like a civilizational trajectory. But the trajectory is not designed. It is the emergent product of activities that mostly do not coordinate with one another. This emergent quality of civilizational development is something an observer would understand better than we typically do ourselves. We tend to think of our civilization as something we are collectively building with intentions and goals and strategies. An observer with sufficient distance would see something different. They would see a complex adaptive system responding to internal and external pressures, producing outcomes that no individual within the system fully controls or predicts. They would see patterns of self-organization that we, from inside, experience as choices, but that from outside appear as the predictable behaviors of a particular kind of system in a particular kind of environment. This perspective is not flattering to our self-image as agents in control of our own development. It is, however, more accurate to what we can observe about how human civilizations actually function. Throughout our history, the civilizations that have arisen have not been the products of design. They have been the products of accident, of accumulation, of local adaptations that turned out to have systemic consequences. The agricultural revolution was not planned. The industrial revolution was not planned. The information revolution that is currently transforming our societies was not planned. These transformations occurred because particular conditions made them possible, and because human beings, responding to local incentives, undertook activities whose aggregate effects produced large-scale change. The same process is operating now in the transformations that will determine our future. We are not collectively deciding what kind of civilization to become. We are responding to local pressures, making individual choices, and the aggregate of those responses is producing a trajectory that no one in particular has designed. The trajectory may be one that, viewed in retrospect, will look like a successful navigation of our current challenges. Or it may look like a failure. We cannot know in advance because we are inside the process, unable to see the patterns that will only become visible at greater distance. What we can do is attempt to influence the local conditions that shape the aggregate. We cannot decide as a species what to become, but we can decide as individuals and as communities what to support and what to resist, what to build and what to refuse. The aggregate effect of these decisions is unpredictable, but it is not random. It is shaped by the values we hold, the priorities we set, the structures we maintain or dismantle. The civilization that emerges from our collective activity will reflect, in some imperfect way, the qualities of the activity itself. If our activity is short-sighted, the civilization will be short-sighted. If our activity attends to long-term consequences, the civilization will have at least some capacity for long-term thinking. This is not a particularly satisfying conclusion because it does not specify what should be done. It only specifies the relationship between what is done and what emerges. The specification of particular actions remains a matter of judgment applied locally in response to specific circumstances. But the recognition that the relationship exists, that our local choices do aggregate into a civilizational character, that the character is not predetermined but is shaped by what we do, is itself a useful recognition. It places responsibility where it actually lies, in the texture of daily decision-making rather than in some imaginary moment of collective resolution that will never come. An observer watching us would see this texture in detail. They would see the millions of small acts of cooperation that hold our societies together and the millions of small acts of defection that erode them. They would see the patient work of those who are trying to build durable institutions and the impatient work of those who are trying to extract value from existing institutions before they collapse. They would see the long arc of human moral development, the gradual extension of consideration to groups previously excluded, the slow accumulation of practices that constrain the worst impulses of our species. They would also see the persistent failures, the recurring violences, the inability of even our most successful societies to extend their successes reliably across the boundaries that separate them from others. The picture they would hold is mixed in ways that should be familiar to us, because we hold the same mixed picture ourselves when we are being honest. Human civilization is not one thing. It is a contradiction, an ongoing struggle between tendencies that pull in different directions. The same species that has produced extraordinary achievements has also produced extraordinary atrocities. The same institutions that have lifted billions out of poverty have also concentrated power in ways that threaten their own foundations. The same technologies that have extended human capability have also extended human destructiveness. The contradictions are not incidental, they are constitutive. They are what we are. What an observer might be watching for, more than any specific achievement, is whether the contradictions can be managed, whether the species can find a way to live with its own complexity, to develop institutions that channel its conflicting tendencies toward outcomes that preserve its long-term viability rather than destroying it. This is not a matter of resolving the contradictions, which is probably impossible. It is a matter of containing them, of building structures sturdy enough to hold the tensions without breaking. Civilizations that manage this task survive. Civilizations that do not fail. The history of our planet, as recorded in the archaeological remains of cultures that did not survive their challenges, is itself an indication of how often the task fails. The current task is larger than any our species has previously faced. It is the task of building structures at planetary scale that can hold the tensions of our entire global civilization. We have not done this before. We have managed local versions of the task with mixed success, but the planetary version is new. We are improvising as we go, building institutions in real time to address problems that are emerging faster than the institutions can develop. The improvisation has produced some successes, but it has also produced systematic failures. Whether the successes will accumulate faster than the failures undermine them is the open question that defines our current moment. An observer watching this improvisation would not be in a position to predict its outcome with confidence. They would see the patterns associated with successful civilizations and the patterns associated with failed ones, and they would see both kinds of patterns in our current behavior. They would understand that the outcome depends on which patterns dominate, which institutions strengthen, which choices accumulate. They would also understand that this is the nature of any civilizational transition, that the outcomes are genuinely uncertain at the time they are being decided, that the question of who survives and who does not is not answered until the decisions have been made and their consequences have played out. This uncertainty is not a problem to be solved, it is the condition under which we live, and under which all civilizations at similar transitions have lived. The civilizations that survived did not do so because they had certainty about their success. They did so because they made decisions in conditions of uncertainty that turned out to favor their continuation. The decisions were not necessarily wise, they were sometimes simply fortunate. But the making of the decisions, the willingness to act in the absence of guaranteed outcomes, was a necessary precondition for survival. Civilizations that froze in the face of uncertainty, that refused to act because they could not predict the consequences, did not survive. The survivors were those who acted, who made bets, who committed themselves to particular trajectories without being able to verify in advance that the trajectories would lead to good places. This is the position we are in now. We have to act in conditions of uncertainty without being able to verify that our actions will succeed. The actions we take will determine the trajectory we follow, and the trajectory will determine whether we survive long enough to be relevant to the questions about contact that we have been considering. The questions about contact are downstream of the questions about survival. We do not need to know what the observers think of us in order to know what we need to do. We need to know what we ourselves think of the situation we are in, and we need to act on the basis of that knowledge with whatever resolve we can muster. The resolve, when it comes, will not come from outside. It will come from the recognition that we are responsible for what we become, and from the willingness to take that responsibility seriously enough to act on it. The recognition is available to anyone who looks at our situation honestly. The willingness is something each person and each community must find within themselves. The aggregate of these individual willingnesses is what will determine whether our civilization survives, whether we eventually qualify for contact, whether the silence around us ever ends or simply continues to frame our slow disappearance from the cosmic record. These are the choices in front of us. They will be made, one way or another, by the cumulative weight of countless decisions across the coming decades. The outcome is not predetermined. It depends on what we do, and what we do depends in some part on whether we understand what is actually at stake. The understanding, if it is to be useful, must be widespread. It must penetrate the routines of daily life, the structures of our institutions, the assumptions of our cultures. It must become part of how we think about ourselves, not as an occasional reflection, but as a constant orientation. Whether such understanding can spread fast enough, deeply enough, to alter the trajectory we are on, is itself one of the open questions that this analysis cannot resolve. But the spreading of the understanding is one of the things that might still be done, and the doing of it is one of the choices that lies within our reach. If understanding is to spread, it must contend with certain features of our current information environment that work against it. We live in a moment characterized by an unprecedented volume of communication distributed across networks that reach nearly every populated corner of our planet, and yet the quality of collective comprehension does not appear to be improving in proportion to the volume of available information. The networks that carry our communications were not designed to optimize for understanding. They were designed to optimize for engagement, for attention, for the metrics that generate revenue within the economic frameworks that built them. The consequence is an information environment in which clarity is harder to achieve than at any previous moment in human history, despite or because of the abundance of available information. An observer watching this development would note something interesting about it. They would note that we have built tools capable of distributing accurate information across the entire planet in real time, and we have used those tools primarily to distribute inaccurate information, distorted narratives, and inflammatory simplifications of complex situations. The capacity for clarity exists. The actual use of the capacity tilts toward confusion. This is not because the people using the tools are stupid. It is because the tools, as designed, reward content that produces emotional reactions over content that produces understanding, and emotional reactions are more easily produced by simplification, distortion, and outrage than by careful analysis. The implications for our collective decision-making are significant. A species that needs to make planetary-scale decisions about complex problems requires an information environment that supports the formation of accurate shared understanding. We have built instead an information environment that systematically undermines the formation of shared understanding, that fragments populations into incompatible interpretive communities, that rewards the construction of identities organized around opposition to other identities rather than around shared engagement with shared problems. This is not a fixable design flaw. It is the natural consequence of building information systems whose economic incentives are not aligned with the production of accurate collective understanding. What an observer would be watching for in this domain is whether we develop the capacity to redesign these systems before their distortions overwhelm our ability to address other challenges. The challenge of climate change cannot be addressed by a population that cannot reach shared understanding about basic facts. The challenge of managing artificial intelligence cannot be addressed by institutions that cannot deliberate without being captured by manufactured controversies. The challenge of coordinating global responses to pandemics cannot be met by societies that have learned to treat public health as a partisan issue. Many of our most important problems are downstream of our information environment, and the deterioration of that environment is itself one of the most pressing problems we face. The deterioration is not, however, irreversible. Information systems are human constructions. They can be rebuilt. The economic incentives that produce their current dysfunctions can be modified by regulation, by competition, by the development of alternative systems that operate on different principles. None of this is easy, but none of it is impossible. The question is whether the political will to attempt the rebuilding will emerge before the existing systems have done sufficient damage to prevent the rebuilding from succeeding. This is a race that we are currently losing in many domains, though there are also signs of resistance, signs of awareness that the current trajectory cannot continue indefinitely, signs of efforts to construct alternatives. The observers, if they are watching, would be watching these efforts with particular attention. The reconstruction of an information environment that supports collective understanding is the kind of institutional achievement that distinguishes civilizations capable of managing planetary-scale problems from those that are not. It is a foundational capability in the sense that other capabilities depend on it. Without shared understanding, no coordinated action is possible. Without coordinated action, no planetary scale problem can be addressed. The question of whether we will develop better information systems is, in some respects, the question of whether we will be able to develop any of the other capacities required for our survival. This is one of many such foundational questions, each of which has the property that its resolution affects the resolution of others. The development of better institutions for global coordination depends on the development of better information systems. The development of better information systems depends on the development of political will to rebuild them. The development of political will depends on the development of shared understanding about why the rebuilding is necessary. The dependencies form a circular pattern in which each requirement depends on others that also need to be met. This circularity is not unique to our current situation. It is characteristic of complex transitions in which multiple changes need to occur together rather than sequentially, because each is a precondition for the others. The resolution of such circular patterns is not impossible, but it is difficult. It typically requires that some component of the system be perturbed strongly enough to break the circular dependency, allowing the other components to begin developing in coordinated ways. The perturbation might be a crisis that makes the current arrangements untenable. It might be a leadership emergence that breaks through existing constraints. It might be a technological development that changes the underlying possibilities. Whatever its source, the perturbation creates the conditions for transformation that would not have occurred under steady-state conditions. We are, perhaps, currently in a period during which multiple such perturbations are occurring simultaneously. The climate crisis is perturbing our economic systems. The information crisis is perturbing our political systems. The emergence of new technologies is perturbing our cultural systems. The interaction of these perturbations creates conditions of high instability, conditions under which large changes become possible that would not be possible under more stable conditions. Whether the changes that emerge will be improvements or further deteriorations depends on choices that have not yet been made, on developments that have not yet occurred, on alignments of interest and capacity that have not yet been achieved. An observer would understand this period as a phase transition, a moment during which the trajectory of our civilization is being determined more by current choices than by past patterns. The phase transitions in civilizational development are the moments when prediction becomes most difficult, because the outcomes depend on which of many possible attractor states the system will settle into. Small differences in initial conditions, in particular choices made at particular moments, can produce large differences in eventual outcomes. The system is responsive during a phase transition in ways that it is not responsive during periods of stable equilibrium. This is both an opportunity and a danger. It is an opportunity because real change becomes possible. It is a danger because the wrong changes become possible too, and there is no guarantee that the changes that emerge will be the ones that favor our continuation. This is the situation we are in. It is genuinely uncertain. The outcomes will be determined by what we do, and what we do will be determined by who we are, and who we are is being shaped in real time by the choices we are making about how to respond to the conditions we find ourselves in. The observers, if they are watching exactly this. They are not waiting for us to declare ourselves. They are watching us declare ourselves through the accumulating record of how we actually behave, what we actually build, what we actually preserve, and what we actually destroy. The declaration we are making is not a verbal declaration. It is the declaration of accumulated action, summed across all of our individual choices, integrated across all of our collective decisions. The declaration is being made whether we mean it to be made or not. The observers can read it as we make it, and what they read will be the determining factor in whatever subsequent decisions they make about us. We do not get to revise the declaration after the fact. We do not get to explain what we meant. We get only to make the declaration in real time through what we actually do. And the declaration will speak for itself in whatever language an observer would use to interpret it. What language would that be? Not any human language, certainly. The language of behavior, of patterns of action, of the structures we build and the structures we tear down. the language of choices made and choices refused, the language of priorities expressed through resource allocation, of values expressed through institutional design, of character expressed through how we treat those who are weaker than ourselves. This is a language that any sufficiently capable observer can read, regardless of their specific cultural background or their specific cognitive architecture. It is the language of how a civilization actually behaves, as distinct from how it talks about itself, and it is the language in which the observers, if they exist, are reading us now. The reading they get is, as we have already noted, mixed. It contains evidence of capacities for cooperation, generosity, and long-term thinking, alongside evidence of capacities for competition, cruelty, and short-term opportunism. Both kinds of evidence are present in the record. The question is, which kind will come to dominate as our civilization continues to develop? The answer to that question is being written every day in the accumulating choices of those of us currently alive. It is not being written in any single dramatic moment. It is being written in the texture of how we live, the small decisions that aggregate into large patterns, the daily expressions of who we are that combine into the larger statement of who we are becoming. The statement, when it is eventually complete, will be the answer to the question that the silence has been asking us all along. Whether we are a species worth knowing, whether we are a civilization worth engaging with, whether we are an intelligence worth meeting, all of these questions reduce in the end to the question of what we make of ourselves in the time we have. The making is ongoing. The answer is not yet final. And what the answer turns out to be depends in ways that are easy to forget but impossible to escape on what each of us chooses to contribute to the making in the small daily ways that are available to us. The cosmos has framed the question. We are providing the answer. The form of the answer is ours to determine. And the determining is happening now in the world as it actually is, in the lives we are actually living, in the choices we are actually making about what kind of beings we wish to be. When the work of providing this answer is considered from the perspective of an individual human life, it becomes apparent how strange the situation actually is. Each person reading these words is part of a species whose future may depend on collective choices, and yet each person experiences their own life as a sequence of personal moments that mostly do not feel cosmically significant. The cosmic significance is real, but it is distributed so thinly across so many lives that no individual life carries a noticeable share of it. The aggregate matters. The individual contribution to the aggregate is small enough to feel inconsequential. This is the experience of being one human among billions in a moment when the actions of those billions will determine outcomes whose implications extend across geological timescales. The disjunction between cosmic significance and personal experience produces a particular kind of difficulty in motivation. It is easy to feel that one's own actions do not matter, that the trajectory of human civilization will be determined by forces beyond one's individual reach, that whatever one does or fails to do will be lost in the noise of billions of other actions producing their own effects. This feeling is in some sense accurate. The individual contribution is indeed small. The aggregate outcomes are indeed determined by forces beyond individual control. And yet, the aggregate is composed of individual contributions, and if everyone reasons in the same way about the negligibility of their own contribution, the aggregate becomes the sum of those negligibilities, which is to say nothing. The observers, if they are watching, would understand this dynamic. They would recognize it as one of the characteristic challenges of civilizations at our stage. The challenge of motivating individual action toward collective goals, when the individual contribution is small and the collective goals are abstract, is not a new problem. It is a problem that any civilization at planetary scale must solve, and the solutions are typically institutional rather than individual. Civilizations that succeed in addressing planetary scale problems do so by building institutions that channel individual action toward collective ends, by creating structures within which individual contributions become meaningful, precisely because they are coordinated with other contributions in ways that produce real aggregate effects. The building of such institutions is itself an institutional task, requiring its own kind of coordination, its own kind of leadership, its own kind of patient effort across long timescales. The institutions that we currently possess were built by previous generations, often in response to crises that made their construction necessary, and they reflect the priorities and constraints of those previous moments. The institutions we need now will have to be built by us, in response to the crises we are facing, reflecting the priorities and constraints of our own moment. The building is ongoing. Some of the institutions that will matter in the coming decades have not yet been founded. Some that have been founded are still in their early stages, working out their procedures and their cultures, establishing the precedents that will shape their future operations. An observer would watch this institution building with particular interest. They would understand that the quality of new institutions matters enormously, because institutions outlast their founders and carry forward the patterns established at their origin. A poorly designed institution can persist for centuries, producing harmful effects long after its original purpose has become irrelevant. A well-designed institution can adapt to changing circumstances, sustain its core functions across generations, and contribute to the stability of the larger civilization across timescales that exceed the lives of those who built it. The current moment is one in which we are designing many new institutions, both formal and informal, and the designs we choose will have consequences extending far beyond what we can currently foresee. The decisions about how to design these institutions are being made now in real time by people who are mostly not thinking about the long-term consequences of their choices. They are responding to immediate pressures, solving immediate problems, building structures that address current needs without fully considering how those structures will behave once they have become embedded in the broader civilizational fabric. This is normal. It is how most institutions have always been built. But it does mean that the institutions emerging from our current moment will, in many cases, carry forward patterns that their builders did not intend, producing effects that their builders did not anticipate. The patterns will be readable, in retrospect, as expressions of who we were when we built them. Whether the patterns will be ones we are proud of or ones we wish we had built differently depends on the quality of attention we bring to the building process now. This is perhaps the most actionable conclusion that can be drawn from this analysis. The choices we face are not, in most cases, choices about whether to engage with cosmic questions. They are choices about how to engage with immediate institutional questions in ways that take account of cosmic considerations. The cosmic considerations enter not as direct subjects of decision, but as context that informs how immediate decisions should be made. The institution we are building today should be one that we would be willing to defend, not only to ourselves and our contemporaries, but to whoever might be watching and to whoever might be inheriting the consequences of our work many generations from now. This is a demanding standard, but it is one that the situation requires. What might it look like to apply such a standard in practice? It would look like attention to long-term consequences in decisions whose immediate consequences appear to be the primary consideration. It would look like resistance to optimizations that produce short-term gains at the cost of long-term liabilities. It would look like willingness to support institutions whose benefits will accrue only after one's own lifetime, even when those institutions require sacrifice from those currently alive. It would look like patience with processes that operate slowly, when those processes are producing outcomes more durable than what could be produced quickly. None of these qualities are easy to cultivate in our current cultural environment, which tends to reward the opposite of each of them. But the cultivation of these qualities is, in many respects, the work that the situation is calling for. The cultivation, if it occurs, will not occur because anyone has been persuaded by abstract arguments about cosmic significance. It will occur because people, in their specific situations, with their specific responsibilities, find ways to make their work consistent with the larger requirements of their moment. The forms this takes will vary enormously. A scientist working on climate modeling, a regulator designing rules for emerging technologies, a teacher preparing students for a future their teachers cannot fully imagine, a parent shaping the values of a child who will inherit the consequences of current choices, a citizen voting for candidates whose policies extend beyond immediate self-interest, an engineer choosing which projects to work on and which to refuse. Each of these positions offers opportunities for the kind of cultivation we have been discussing, and the cultivation, in each case, looks like the specific work of that specific position, done with attention to its larger implications. This kind of distributed cultivation, occurring across millions of positions simultaneously, is what aggregates into the institutional capacity that distinguishes surviving civilizations from failing ones. It is not glamorous. It does not lend itself to dramatic narratives. It happens mostly in offices and laboratories, in classrooms and homes, in the small acts of attention that mostly go unrecorded. But the aggregation of these small acts is what the larger story is made of, and the quality of the aggregation depends on the quality of the individual acts that compose it. The observers, watching from whatever distance they watch from, would see this aggregation. They would assess it on the basis of its actual patterns, not on the basis of how the participants describe what they are doing. And what they assess in the end will be the determining factor in whatever decisions they make about us. There remains one final consideration that this analysis should address before concluding. It is the question of what we should make of the possibility that this entire framework is mistaken. We have been reasoning as if the silence is the product of deliberate decisions by advanced civilizations. We have considered various motivations such civilizations might have for maintaining the silence. We have explored what those motivations would imply about how we should think about our situation. But all of this rests on assumptions that could be wrong. There may be no advanced civilizations. The silence may be the product of cosmic emptiness rather than cosmic restraint. We may be alone in a much more literal sense than this analysis has assumed. What would we make of that possibility? The recognition that we might be alone in the strong sense has its own implications for how we should conduct ourselves. If there are no observers, then the question of whether we qualify for contact is moot. The work we do to develop our civilization will not be evaluated by external witnesses. It will simply happen or fail to happen with consequences that affect only ourselves and the other species that share our planet. The stakes do not become smaller in this scenario. They become, in some ways, larger. The responsibility is more entirely ours. There is no possibility of eventual rescue, no possibility of eventual recognition, no possibility of joining any community that exists outside our own efforts to build it. This possibility, paradoxically, does not change very much about what we should do. The work of becoming a viable civilization is the same work, regardless of whether anyone is watching. The institutions we need to build are the same institutions. The choices we need to make are the same choices. The only thing that changes is the framing, the cosmic context within which our local responsibilities are situated. If we are alone, the responsibilities are no less real. They are simply more solitary. The meaning we construct for our existence has to come in this scenario entirely from within our own efforts, with no possibility of validation from outside. This is harder in some ways. It is also in some ways more honest. Whether we are alone or accompanied by silent observers, the practical implications converge. We have work to do. The work is the work of building a civilization that can survive its own technological adolescence and mature into something durable. The work has its own justification, independent of whether anyone is watching. And the doing of the work is the only response, in either scenario, that makes sense given our actual situation. The silence around us is what it is. The response to the silence is what we choose to make it. And the choices are, as they have always been, ours to make in the time we have, with the capacities we possess, against whatever odds the situation presents. It is worth pausing before we close to consider how this entire framework would appear if examined from a different angle. We have been reasoning as if the question of contact, the question of our cosmic significance, the question of whether anyone is watching, are questions of central importance to human civilization. There is an alternative perspective worth taking seriously, which is that these questions, however interesting, are not actually central to anything. They are interesting to us because we are the kind of creatures who find such questions interesting. But the universe does not become different depending on how we answer them. Our civilization does not become different depending on whether we are watched. The work in front of us is the same regardless of which framing we adopt. This alternative perspective has a certain merit. It resists the temptation to inflate the importance of questions whose practical implications are limited. Whether or not aliens are watching us, the climate is changing. Whether or not we are being evaluated, our institutions are struggling to manage planetary-scale problems. Whether or not contact will eventually occur, the choices we are currently making about how to develop our technology, organize our societies, and treat our planet will have consequences that determine the conditions of human life for generations to come. The cosmic questions are, in this view, a kind of distraction. They are interesting, but they are not the questions on which anything important actually depends. There is something to be said for this view, but it is not, I think, entirely correct. The cosmic questions matter not because they are practically actionable, but because they affect how we understand ourselves. A species that believes itself to be the only intelligent life in the universe will conduct itself differently from a species that believes itself to be one among many. A species that believes itself to be the chosen object of cosmic attention will conduct itself differently from a species that believes itself to be largely ignored. The beliefs do not change the underlying situation, but they do change how the situation is experienced, and the experience affects the choices that are made within it. The cosmic questions, in this sense, are not separate from the practical questions. They are framings within which the practical questions get answered, and the framings matter. The framing that this analysis has been developing places us in a particular kind of relationship with the cosmos. We are not central. We are not chosen. We are not, as far as we can tell, the object of any particular cosmic concern. We are, instead, one developing civilization among an unknown number of others, occupying a moment of transition that other civilizations have also occupied, facing challenges that other civilizations have also faced, with outcomes that depend on what we ourselves do, rather than on any external intervention. This framing carries certain implications for how we should think about our work. It implies a kind of humility about our place in the cosmos, combined with a kind of seriousness about our responsibility for our own future. The humility and the seriousness reinforce one another. Neither requires the other to be false, but each is strengthened by the presence of the other. The humility comes from recognizing that we are not special in any cosmic sense. The universe is not waiting for us. We are not the protagonists of any story larger than the story we are telling ourselves about ourselves. The recognition of this is freeing in a certain way. It releases us from the burden of having to be cosmically significant. We do not have to live up to any external expectations about what humanity is supposed to become. We do not have to fulfill any cosmic purpose. We can simply be what we are and try to become what we are capable of becoming, without having to justify our development to any external audience. The seriousness comes from recognizing that even if we are not cosmically special, we are still responsible for our own outcomes. The lack of external significance does not diminish the importance of what we are doing. It changes the source of the importance, locating it in ourselves rather than in any external recognition of our worth. We matter to ourselves, and we matter to whatever future we manage to construct, and the mattering is not contingent on anyone else's attention. The work has its own weight, independent of whether the work is being watched. This combination of humility and seriousness produces, I think, the appropriate posture for a civilization in our position. It is not the posture of a chosen species, confident of its cosmic destiny. It is not the posture of an insignificant species, resigned to its eventual disappearance. It is the posture of a species that has come to understand its own situation, has accepted the realities that situation imposes, and has decided to do its work anyway, without expecting cosmic validation, but without abandoning the work either. This posture is rare in human history. Most cultural traditions have not encouraged it. Most ideologies have promised either cosmic significance or cosmic insignificance, rather than the middle position that combines elements of both. But the middle position is, I think, the position the actual situation requires, and the cultivation of this position is part of what the maturation of our civilization would involve. The cultivation will not happen all at once. It will happen, if it happens, in the gradual emergence of cultural frameworks that support it, in the gradual modification of educational systems to communicate it, in the gradual development of institutions that embody it. The process will be slow. It will be uneven. It will be contested by those who prefer the older framings, both the framings of cosmic specialness and the framings of cosmic insignificance. But the process is not impossible, and its outcomes, if they emerge, will be among the things that distinguish a mature civilization from an immature one. The civilizations that survive their transitions are those that develop the capacity to hold their situation honestly, neither inflating it into cosmic drama, nor deflating it into nihilism, but recognizing it for what it is and acting accordingly. This is, in the end, what the silence may be teaching us. Not that we are alone, and not that we are accompanied by hidden watchers, but that the question of which of these is the case is less important than the question of what we are going to do regardless. The silence is the condition under which we work. The work is what we are responsible for. The outcomes of the work will be what they are, and the relationship between the work and any eventual cosmic engagement is something we cannot determine in advance. What we can do is the work itself, with the qualities of attention and care that the work requires, in whatever time we have, with whatever capacities we possess. The civilization that emerges from this work, if it emerges at all, will be different from any civilization that has yet existed on our planet. It will carry within it the lessons of our current struggles, the institutional innovations that resolved them, the cultural maturity that allowed the resolution to occur. It will be a civilization that has come to terms with its actual position in the cosmos, neither central nor negligible, but engaged with its own work in a way that does not depend on cosmic validation. It will be a civilization capable, in principle, of meeting other civilizations as something close to peers, if such meetings ever become possible. And it will be a civilization capable, in any case, of sustaining itself across the long timescales that any civilization needs to sustain itself if it is to count as durable. Whether we will become this civilization remains uncertain. The path is not impossible, but it is not guaranteed. The choices that determine the outcome are being made now in the conditions we are currently living through, by people who are mostly not thinking explicitly about the long-term consequences of their choices. The choices will aggregate into a trajectory, and the trajectory will lead somewhere. Where it leads depends on the quality of the choices that compose it, and the quality of those choices depends, in part, on the framings within which the choices are being made. The framings are themselves things we can affect by how we think and talk and write about our situation, by the cultural materials we create and the educational practices we sustain. This is one of the reasons that work of this kind, careful examination of our cosmic situation and its implications, has its own value. It does not solve any immediate problem. It does not produce any actionable policy recommendation. It does not, by itself, change the trajectory of our civilization in any measurable way. But it contributes, in some small way, to the larger cultural conversation within which the relevant framings are being developed. It is one voice among many, offering one perspective among many, on questions that will continue to be asked and answered in many forms by many people across the coming decades. The accumulation of such voices, each contributing its own careful attention to the questions at hand, is part of how cultural maturity develops, where it develops at all. The contributions are not individually decisive, they are collectively important. We have, in the course of this analysis, considered many possibilities about who might be watching us, what they might think of us, what conditions might govern eventual contact, what we might do given our situation. We have not arrived at any single conclusion that resolves the questions we began with. We have arrived instead at a more careful understanding of why those questions are difficult to resolve, what the available evidence permits us to say, and what postures might be appropriate given the available evidence. This is, I think, what intellectual work of this kind can produce. Not certainty, but more careful uncertainty. Not answers, but better questions. Not solutions, but improved understanding of the problems we are working on. The improvement is incremental. and it is partial, but it is real. And it is the kind of improvement that aggregates over time into the cultural resources that future generations will have to draw on as they continue the work that we have begun.